Right. Hello, my name is Yasmeen Baran, and today I will be presenting my Watchmen final. My presentation will be covering the idea of graphic novels as art, and I will be discussing what is considered a graphic novel and how Watchmen ties into that definition. I will also be analyzing various artistic methods comic artists use in graphic novels to help tell the narrative in a graphic manner, which include rendering, reoccurring objects, color choices, and dialogue choices. So throughout the supplemental readings from this semester and throughout my findings in the annotated bibliography assignment, I found three main definitions that I think do a really great job of giving you an idea of what a graphic novel is. And I'm first going to talk about those three definitions and how Watchmen fits into those definitions. So the first definition everyone should be familiar with because it comes from Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which we all read prior to starting the Watchmen project in class. If you recall in the beginning of the book, McCloud quotes Will Eisner, who is a famous comic artist, as describing comics as sequential art. I understand McCloud is talking about comics in general in this book, but I also think it works really well in describing graphic novels specifically. So sequential art is the idea that if we took one panel from Watchmen and blew it up to poster size, it suddenly becomes a single image not connected to any backstory or what is really going on in the storyline at that point. It's really just kind of a snapshot. But when we see a procession of panels, one after another, that obviously are meant to read as a sequence, we suddenly see movement and action. Here's an example of this when the explosion happens at midnight in New York City. And then another example of this would be on page 146 in chapter 5 when we see Rorschach pay a little visit to Moloch in the middle of the night at his house. As Moloch walks down the stairs of his bedroom into the kitchen with a handgun, there is no dialogue or narrative text to tell us Moloch quietly walked down to the kitchen, or even Moloch whispering to himself, "I better go check in the kitchen." The sequential images side by side, all relating to one another, express that dialogue without him actually needing to say those words or the need for a narrator, to be telling us that. If we just saw one of these panels blown up like it is on the right-hand side, it would look pretty out of context. We wouldn't really know where Moloch is, if he was in his house, or if he was in somebody else's, or where he was going, or if he was looking at someone. So the second definition comes from one of my research scholarly sources. The definition explains that graphic novels are extended comic books that contain the depths and subtlety we have come to expect of traditional novels and extended nonfiction texts. When I first came across this quote, I immediately thought of chapter 4, pages 111 and 112, in Watchmen, where we see Dr. Manhattan sitting in space narrating the past relationship between him and Janie Slater, while also simultaneously explaining what is going on in the present tense. He's also counting down the moments when he will drop the photograph out of his hand, and these few pages show only a tiny example of the complex depth we associate with a traditional novel being carried out the same, if not more successful, in a graphic novel like Watchmen, where we have illustrated panels right in front of us to coincide Dr. Manhattan's dialogue. The idea of graphic novels almost getting the complex points of a storyline across even more effectively than a traditional written novel is something that I had come up in another scholarly source as well. The source talked about a case study where teachers were instructed to choose a non-fictional graphic novel and analyze whether or not they recognized historical agency in it and if they would consider using the graphic novel as part of their own classroom curriculum to potentially replace a written novel. So one participant named Bob said, "While reading, I saw the photograph of white officers watching the fight with binoculars, and it really put it into perspective. So although an author could have easily explained that same scene narratively, there was something extra Bob got from that being depicted graphically versus narratively." The last definition I came across that I thought explained what a graphic novel is very nicely is this one. A graphic novel is an illustrated work that involves a more mature audience in which a dramatic arc is followed where content is presented with a definite beginning, middle, and end, as opposed to comic strips that appear weekly or comic books in which a cast of characters has infinite ongoing plot lines, like, say, Batman or Superman. Watchmen very much follows this definition, along with also bending it a bit when you look at the ending of Watchmen. After reading Watchmen, I feel like you could interpret two areas of the book as the ending, so to say. The first is at the beginning of chapter 12, on pages 383 through 387, where the clock is finally striking midnight and we see that this terrible massacre has happened. And although the book could have ended at the explosion there, which I feel like would have been the conventional route, the idea of the last pages of Watchmen leaving us at a spot no one would have suspected makes the book that much more epic. The last panel on page 414 of the happy face t-shirt and the young man sifting through the crank file really makes the ending feel like more of the ending with a question mark versus the ending with a period, because technically it could go on past this if he chooses to pick Rorschach's journal. So the use of dialogue, repeating objects, and specific artistic choices all prove how brilliant Watchmen is as a graphic novel, but also how strong it is as a work of art. So the significance behind drawings of photographs in a comic world is a big artistic component that I was not aware of prior to reading this scholarly article about it. Roy T. Cook writes a compelling argument on how when art or comic book creators decide to have realistically drawn photographs in the graphic novel, we suddenly start experiencing an event in the fictional world along with the characters. The realistically drawn photograph suddenly adds another dimension between us and the comic world. One example of this can be found in the supplemental documents section that is found at almost all the ends of the chapters. At the end of chapter 6 on page 207, Cook notes that the rendering style in Rorschach's mugshot is more realistic than the depictions of Rorschach in the panel, including more and more realistic detailing and subtler shading. Another example of this can be found on chapter 8, where we see the drafts of the New Frontiersman paper before it goes out to print. The crop and bleed lines in the corners of the paper is something that you wouldn't see if you were buying a newspaper, or the Scotch tape, or even the little razor blade on the left-hand side, and the pencil all contribute to this idea of another dimension between the reader's life and the fantasy life. The New Frontiersman newspaper front page displays a phenomenon Cook explains as a photograph in a comic being rendered in a more realistic style than the artwork found in the remainder of the comic. Out of all three photos, the one on the right of the night owl, I believe, most closely depicts Cook's phenomenon. Words written on the newspaper in handwriting like photos to come or continued on page 2 give us the sense that this is a rough draft and that we, the readers, are seeing it before it is released into the world, which is the Watchmen world in this case. Reoccurring analog clocks are another artistic choice we see in Watchmen. They are shown at the beginning of each chapter page and throughout the panels and backgrounds of the book. The chapter pages directly rate back to Eisner's quote of comics being sequential art, since we see the blood drop down farther and farther as the story progresses, along with the clock hands moving towards midnight. Here are some other examples of clocks in the backgrounds of panels, all specifically set to the same time no matter what part of the book they show up in. On page 49 on the right-hand side, when we see the comedian attempt to rape Sally Jupiter, there's a clock above the door sill when he's zipping his pants and walking out. Another clock appears on chapter 8 on page 274 when Hollis is sitting at his chair and he hears someone knocking on the door. We also see two more appear on page 366 and 367 when Ozymandias is watching the JFK assassination on his TVs on the left-hand side, and another when he is referring to the Minutemen meeting in 1966 when talking to Rorschach and the Night Owl at his Antarctic palace. Color is also another huge role in creating a certain mood that the comic book creators want us to feel. An analogous color scheme of yellow, orange, and red are used in multiple places of Watchmen during times of death, stress, and extreme violence. Right off the bat on page 11, in chapter 1, the entire breakdown of how the comedian was murdered is depicted in the black, orange, and red color scheme. Also, his yellow button is in every panel. Again, we see this when Rorschach is discussing the 1975 kidnapping case to Dr. Malcolm in jail, where he split the heads of two dogs open on pages 198 and 199. The dogs are orange and sit on a reddish background and are chewing yellow bones. The Rorschach diagrams on the lower right-hand side of the screen also are depicted in yellow, orange, and red. We see this again when Hollis is murdered at his home on Halloween night. The scuffle ends in a yellow, orange, and red themed background with his blood all over the mess that is left at his open front door. The actual strike from the trophy on page 274 in the top row in the middle is also illustrated in an all-over wash of red, black, and white. One last design choice I want to discuss that we see in graphic novels, and we especially see Watchmen do a really great job of, is simultaneous dialogue. So what I'm referring to is the sections of Watchmen where we are reading two conversations at once. The first is of various people who come to the newsstand and chat with Bernard, or sometimes ignore him, like we see Bernie do when he's reading the Tales of Black Friday next to the newsstand. The graphic elements which tell us that these are two separate dialogues is Bernard's conversations appearing in only white speech bubbles, while Tales of the Black Friday are in these beige curled scroll text boxes. So looking at page 152, we see this happening. We first read, "My home and my family were doomed, my world reduced to ruin. Fate had dealt its hand casually, despite my bitter protestations." And when we go to read the next text box, we know, "Hey, turkey, quit splashing," isn't coming from the same conversation due to the color and shape differentiation of the two text boxes. Although that differentiation is subtle, it is a very effective way in making the reader know that those two dialogues are not connected to each other. And this type of thing would be very difficult, if not impossible, to do in a traditional written novel, but we see carried out beautifully in a graphic novel format. So to wrap up, I have just presented you with a group of definitions you can use to describe what a graphic novel is and how Watchmen specifically fits into that genre. I've also introduced you to a few artistic choices comic artists use to help aid them in storytelling. And lastly, I will leave you with a quote from a scholarly article I read about why graphic novels are an especially great tool for educational learning, and more specifically a great tool for students who fall under the Generation Y demographic, meaning you were born between 1982 and 2003. And I know every time you look up the age range of Gen Y or different demographics like that, every source is a little bit different of what years they consider part of that demographic, but in the article I read, they went by 82 to 03 as what they considered Gen Y. So the quote says, "Graphic novels provide for rich conversation while minimizing efforts and optimizing the limited attention span of many undergraduates." I, for one, feel like I can vouch for that statement. I often lose focus with lengthy books, and I hadn't really read a graphic novel before this English class, and I was shocked at how hooked I really got on the book and how much more I responded and absorbed material from a graphic novel versus a narrative one. Alright, so that concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching, and then I have my works cited page here, and that's it. Thank you.